Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about two things that are really important. One is build to rent communities, and the second is short-term rentals. So if you want to know what the city of Mulberry is doing about these two items, stay tuned and I'm going to explain more. My name is Michael Coker and I'm the mayor of the city of Mulberry, and we have been addressing two resident concerns lately through the use of our ordinances. So at the time of this recording, we have had the first read of two different types of ordinances that deal with two different types of rental communities. The first is the build to rent ordinances, which deals with these neighborhoods that are popping up that you see where a developer comes in and builds a whole new neighborhood that is just rentals. The second deals with short-term rentals, or things like Airbnb, VRBO, and the city wanted to be proactive in taking an approach of these two types of communities and these two types of rentals to make sure that everyone in our community feels safe, that we maintain the character of the community, and then ultimately people are allowed to own their own home instead of just renting it. One of the biggest concerns that we hear about are these build-to-rent communities. As you know, we have many of them that have popped up in the city of Mulberry. I think there's one in every single of the 5 districts in Mulberry. And so these build-to-rent communities keep popping up. You keep seeing them showing up more and more. And often these communities are not owned even by somebody within the state of Georgia. Often they're companies out of California, Arizona, New Jersey that own these communities that come in, they build a development, they build a neighborhood, and then ultimately it ends up being rentals only. Now, we've all been renters at some point in our life. I had to rent when I was in college, when I was young. And so I want to be clear is that the city's not anti-renters. We understand that rentals are a big part of our community. But what the concern becomes is when too many of your developments become strictly rentals, it kind of tends to price out families and people who want to own a house, that want to live in the city and want to put their roots down in this city and own a piece of property, a piece of the American dream. And so if you've been following the news, this has been a really hot issue lately, not just here in Mulberry, but across the state of Georgia. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution came out with a news story that talked about how Metro Atlanta has more of these rental houses than most any other city in the country. And the reason being is that we are a hot market. People want to move to Georgia. People want to move to the Metro Atlanta area and live here. And so these big development hedge funds and investment companies see a huge opportunity in the residential market to put rental communities in place so that they can capitalize on that. Now, as I stated before, rentals are not always bad. Not all rental communities are bad. Not all rental companies are bad. But the problem is when you start to have too many of these rental communities, it does tend to artificially drive up the cost for people who want to own their own home. And it makes it just more difficult, especially when you have someone maybe selling their home and maybe you have younger families or a couple or an individual who wants to purchase that house, but now they're competing against these investors from California. And the reality is that investor cash just spends better than a family who's looking to purchase their first home on a loan or on a mortgage. And it makes it extremely difficult for those buyers. And so these rental aspects have become very interesting to the city of Mulberry, and we've started to look into what can we do to address those concerns. Now, you might have seen, as I mentioned, these build-to-rent communities, and one of my concerns and one of the things that I mentioned is sometimes the city council or the county commission or whoever approves those developments don't even know that it's going to be a rental community at the time. And sometimes I can find that very disingenuous, right? When these builders come in and they say, oh, we're going to build these single family houses. They're going to be these beautiful homes, thinking that it's going to allow people to move into Mulberry, to be able to be part of our community, to own a piece of this community. And then sometimes intentionally, meaning sometimes they go and They intentionally mislead and make you think that they're going to sell them and it was always going to be a rental community. Sometimes the circumstances change. Maybe the builder can't sell the houses, and so they say, okay, well, now we're going to make this neighborhood a rental community. But whatever the circumstances is, sometimes the developer's not always forthcoming with the information that this is going to be a rental-only neighborhood. And so sometimes some of these developments in the past had been approved because the county commission at Gwinnett had thought that these were going to be homes that were going to be sold to families or to make housing more affordable, when in reality it had ended up being, like I said, some hedge fund or some investment company that really wasn't totally truthful with their purpose. That's where you have to be careful, and you have to do a good job of doing your investigation, checking in and seeing what is the true purpose behind this. And so that's when the city of Mulberry stepped in. That's when the city of Mulberry said, what can we do to address this growing concern that many of our constituents have? And what we did is we proposed an ordinance that applies to these build-to-rent communities. Now, there are legal requirements in what you can and can't do with build-to-rent communities. So, a lot of people just say, hey, why don't you do this or do that? Unfortunately, there's constitutional protections. There's other requirements of things that have to be done. And so you have to have a really good, well-drafted ordinance as far as the regulation of these communities. And so what the city of Mulberry did is we've done just that. And we've presented a proposal of an ordinance that puts some additional requirements on these build-to-rent communities. Things like these build-to-rent communities have to be licensed by the city. So that means that these build-to-rent communities, these owners have to come before the city at least once every year and submit an application to basically be licensed to have a rental community here. And in order to do so, there's many requirements that they have to meet. One of the biggest things that the AJC article disclosed was that many of these rental communities have these hedge funds that are out of state, and so these properties are not well maintained. You have a poor family or a poor individual that's suffering because maybe a toilet overflowed or maybe the hot water heater is broken, and they're calling the rental company over and over and over again, and they can't basically get them to come and do service and fix the problem. And so it puts them in this terrible situation because they're renting from this out-of-state company. They're doing everything that they're supposed to be doing by paying the rents, by being on time with their payments, by being good renters. And it's the rental company that's the bad actor, that's not coming to fix the items that need to be fixed. And so the first thing that this ordinance does, it prevents that. So it has minimum standards for maintenance, for upkeep, for various items that need to be done in the community. And one of the main requirements for these applications and for these licenses, you have to have in the community a rental office. So you have to have a representative that's in the actual community, during regular business hours or whenever it may be. So these people can go to that space. They're not calling a 1-800 number. They're not sitting there and saying, hey, I can't get anybody to come. They're sitting on hold, calling over and over again. No, if you have a problem, you can just walk up the street to your rental community office, let them know the issue so that somebody's there to address and hear your concern. And I think just that regulation alone, right, of requiring this maintenance and this upkeep and the individual to be on site is going to, number one, it's going to bring higher quality rental communities into our area. So the rental communities that will stay here, that are existing, are going to have to basically be good neighbors and take care of the properties that are here. There's other requirements as well, like they can't advertise, they can't put signage everywhere that says rental here, that allows these neighborhoods to kind of seamlessly fit into the character of the rest of the city. And so this ordinance has a whole list of items that they have to do, and if they do not, the city has the opportunity to take action for their failure to do so. And so these rental communities, by bringing in these ordinances, by bringing in these items, is something that we can help use as a tool to make sure that if we do have these rental communities, that they become and they remain good neighbors in our area. And other cities have taken similar action. City of Snellville, for example, did a build-to-rent ordinance very similar to ours, where they put these minimum standards, these minimum requirements, And what they saw practically was that many of the bad actors, many of the kind of neighbor builders and investment companies who didn't take care of their properties, they didn't even want to come into Snellville. They didn't even want to do business there anymore because the reality is it just cost them too much money. And so what you were left with was a much higher quality product, and the ability for the city to take more action in denying licenses and denying permits if they failed to do what they were supposed to do. It requires them to come forward every single year, so there's a review every single year that's done. There's additional licensing requirements. They have to have a business license in the city, so we know exactly who is operating that rental community. It's not like, again, some LLC that nobody knows who it is or where they're from or this or that. And so that build to rent ordinance has been proposed first, with first read for the city council. As of the date of the recording, this has gone before the planning commission, and they've taken a vote on it, and it will return back to the city council for their consideration. So I would encourage you to really follow that closely, follow that ordinance if that's something that's important to you. You can always come to City Hall. You can give a public comment. You can talk about the ordinances and any suggestions you might have of how we can improve it. But make sure that your voice is heard on these build-to-rent communities that we tend to see not just popping up all over our city, but all over, whether that's you see them in Jefferson, you see them in Jackson County, you see them in DeKalb County, you see them in Sandy Springs. I mean, they're popping up everywhere. And so this is a growing issue, like I said, that's addressed not just in our city, but statewide and even nationally as well. You've probably heard some Congress has talked about this as well, and it's a bipartisan issue because people on both sides of the aisle are concerned. What does this mean for home ownership? What does this mean for people like me when my wife and I first got married and we bought our first house? Are our children going to be able to afford a first house because so much of the inventory is getting purchased and bought by these rental communities? And so it's a big issue. It's a national issue, and it's definitely something that we here at the city of Mulberry are taking very seriously and looking at. And this is just, I should say too, this is just the initial ordinance. So if the city council feels like more regulations are necessary or more requirements are needed for build to rent, we can always add to it. So we can always go back, we can change it, we can add to it. And so again, if you're somebody that maybe you're passionate about this issue or you have some advanced knowledge, I'd encourage you to reach out to the city, come to the city council meetings, do a public comment, and talk to us about it so we can learn more about your opinion and what you think about build-to-rent communities. But definitely follow that ordinance. That's a big one. So that's the first major ordinance that's coming through the city of Mulberry right now. The second one deals with short-term rentals. And short-term rentals are things like Airbnb, like I said, VRBO, vacation rentals, anything that's rented for a shorter period of time. So we're not talking about people who rent a home now for a year or more. This is for short-term rentals, things like a vacation house, like when you go to the beach, or maybe you go, rent a house with your family at the lake. These are those kind of rentals. And we definitely want to make sure that those individuals who rent out their house on a short-term basis as an Airbnb, that they too are being good neighbors to the other people in their community. And so this is another ordinance that was proposed, was a short-term rental ordinance, which again puts very important requirements on what needs to be done with a short-term rental. And so the biggest concern here is obviously nobody wants their neighbor's house to turn into a party house every Saturday night where the music's blaring, there's 40 cars outside. And other cities have had major issues with this, where people are renting houses for house parties, throwing a big party, trashing the house at all hours of the night, and then leaving. And obviously that's something that our constituents are really concerned about, that we don't want to happen. And so this short-term rental ordinance puts much more stringent requirements on what can and cannot be done in a short-term rental. And it basically outlines things like, noise aspects, cars. You can't have a bunch of cars parked in the front yard, for example. And so this new short-term rental ordinance gives a list of items that must be done. And again, these individuals must come and register with the city. So we know exactly who the owner is. We know exactly who to contact if there's a problem. We can send code enforcement out if a neighbor calls and we know exactly what the deal is. And if they fail to register or fail to take the appropriate action as they should, then obviously the city now, under that ordinance, has the ability to send code enforcement out and to issue citations if something goes awry. And so this is another ordinance that I would definitely recommend that you follow and keep an eye on, because as we move forward regarding short-term rentals, we also want to hear from you. We know that some people talk about short-term rentals in the sense of, we use them, if we want to make Mulberry a destination, right? If we want to make Mulberry be a place where people want to come, spend an evening, stay overnight. We don't have a hotel yet. And so that would be something that short-term rentals would give that option. But again, we want to protect our neighborhoods and the character of those neighborhoods. And so we want to get out ahead of that as a city council, as a city, to make sure that if there was a bad actor, if there was somebody who was taking advantage of the situation, that the city has the ability to take action. And so those are two major ordinances dealing with rentals, some in the long term with the build to rent and some in the short term on the short-term rentals. But it's just two issues that we continue to address as a city, we continue to take a look at. Just like I said, for the build to rent, this second read of this ordinance will be coming up for the city council. So it's for the short-term rentals, for the Airbnbs. So again, if you're passionate about this is something that you feel like we need to know more about or hear your opinion, I encourage you to reach out to your local council person. Or, like I said, come to our next city council meeting, talk to us about it, let us know, and we'd be more than happy to hear what you have to say. But those are two big ordinances that are coming through right now that you need to know about. And just so you understand what your city council is doing to continue to protect the character and the quality of life here in Mulberry. So again, my name is Michael Coker. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out for me. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. We've had a great following. Our number of subscribers have gone up tremendously lately. And so I just want to personally say thank you to everyone out there that listens to these updates, that's been supportive of us, and we'll continue to keep them coming. We'll continue to keep you updated about these changes and things going on at City Hall. But until then, keep listening, and we'll see you next time.